Well, one of the great pleasures of World Architecture Festival since we started back in 2008 has been discovering the quality of architecture in areas where architects do not, on the whole, have a very high profile, at least in the international architectural community. And one of those areas is sub-Saharan Africa. And to tell us about how you can design resilient architecture in sub-Saharan Africa is Issa Diabete, who is a partner in Coffee and Diabete, who come from Cote d'Ivoire, and they won a WAF category for sports building the first year we were in Amsterdam in 2018. So Issa, welcome, and tell us about resilient design in sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I will right away start talking to you about resilient architecture in Africa, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. I think what is the main characteristic of practicing in this part of the world is the fact that we have to deal with other challenges than the ones we usually foresee when we're doing architecture in other geographies. And the very first ones that we have to deal with is the context. This context is, of course, very different than it is in other places, in other countries. And what characterizes this context is the fact that we have a few items that I think are very important in the way we view architecture here. And the first one is the fact that we have to design for an exponential growing population. As you can imagine, Abidjan in the 70s was about 1 million people. And today we're flirting with 6 or 7 million people in a city that was initially designed for 1.5 million people. So that, of course, creates a certain number of problems. And of course, on this image, you can see how Abidjan was planned, right after the independence in the 60s, and how it's sort of evolved until today in 2020 in terms of planning, in terms of urban planning vision. So the vision in the process has been lost. And what we see happening with the exponential demographic growth is the inability for governance to still be able to plan with a very sound planning and very sound direction. And of course, in the absence of government vision, the architect, I think, is the one to come up with a vision, because that's what we do all the time. We tend to deal with many trades, and we sort of turn them into something that makes sense. So it was for us kind of a priority to start engaging in more than just creating buildings and doing architecture at a different level. And another very important item I have to layer onto what I've just said is the fact that now we're in a tech world. And with a population 70% being below 30, you can imagine how the tech world will have an impact on the architecture of tomorrow. So this is pretty much the way the cities are designed now. There's very, very little vision about how do we go about urban planning, what direction we go into. We need to densify. I mean, we're in part of the world where land is scarce. And we need to actually figure out different ways of doing architecture. And as you can see on this image, this is what happened at the edges of the city. Most of the time, people start building, and then the city has to sort of reconcile the little dots and join them with roads that were not planned from the beginning. So to address this context now, we have to pretty much rely on other solutions than the traditional ones. We do think that in the context of exponential growth, the usual urban planning solution cannot work, and it's time to test new ones. My personal feeling is that we need to come back to human scale in terms of city planning. And we've noticed that in many neighborhoods of Abidjan, we have some village type organization with chief at the center, with central authority, which has a tendency to create a sound development at a micro scale. So you have the chief in the center, and then the rest of the population will follow. I will now talk to you about what we do in this place called La Cine Mafia, which is what we call our design lab. It's a place that is about an hour away from Abidjan, the main city of Côte d'Ivoire. And we've chosen this place because of its not only its geographical configuration, it's a strip of land in between the ocean and the lagoon, but also because going away from a more formal environment, we could test new typologies and test new ways of doing architecture. And these new ways, of course, started with the community. How do we deal with the community? On many levels. The first level is a social level. How do we get integrated into the community so we can later on be quite instrumental in proposing new ways of doing urbanism. And the other way, of course, is the local architecture and the indigenous architecture that we found there that will later inform the way we do now our more contemporary architecture. So I will start with the church. The church is actually a community project. It was actually funded by people in the area. Many people gave and provided materials, from the roof sheeting to concrete to the wood and to the architecture. We donated the architecture as a part of an effort to make this happen. And also going along, we pretty much rely very much on the local principles of architecture. You saw on this first slide this indigenous building built with wooden slots. And the reason they build that way in that region is because we're looking for cross ventilation all the time. We want to have the air go through. It's tropical sub-Saharan Africa, which is quite humid, over 85, 90% of humidity in the air. And in order to avoid the humidity to stagnate inside the building, we need to create some sort of airflow. And as you can see in this church, we're taking the air from below and very simple basic system and have the air go through up so that it can create a nice airflow inside. And here's an image of the inside of the church on a Sunday. But beyond the architecture, we also do some what we call local urbanism, pretty much, is with no mandate from any official government or administration. We go about and talk to our neighbors about ways or different ways or possible ways to sort of take care of our environment. How do we, for instance, provide sidewalks in neighborhoods where it wasn't planned by government? How do we create parks and open spaces for the people in the community? And doing all of that without the help or the financing of government. It's usually about walking to your neighbor and proposing and discussing, and in the end, convincing them to follow your vision. I will now move to some of the projects that we have actually built in this area. And as you can see, there's a very specific typology about how we go about doing the roofs. Usually the volumes are quite simple, and the main feature we want to have here is cross ventilation. We want the air to come in from one side and go out the other way. And this sort of cross ventilation allows the space inside to have pretty comfortable temperature. You can also see on some of those images that the roof is also ventilated. What happens with a double roof is that when you have the heat on top of the roof, it doesn't translate in, or it doesn't go inside into the internal spaces, because you have a buffer zone with an airflow that chases the hot air and doesn't allow it to go inside. So these are features that we've used a lot in some of our buildings. Here you can see different buildings using similar typology. Of course, you can see that the spaces are quite open because we can allow to do that in tropical Africa. We don't necessarily aim to enclose all the spaces, and we rely very much on the interstitial spaces that you have in between the buildings to create some kind of very local feel about the architecture that we build there. On this image, you can see actually how the cross ventilation works and how actually the roof gets hot air. It gets rid of the hot air. Here is another house where you can see that we're using bamboo to actually shade and provide privacy to the internal spaces. This is quite important to rely on systems that are existent in the area so that we can actually reinterpret them and create sort of new typology or modern typology with pretty much indigenous systems. Here you can see how the natural and local materials are used to create transparency and airflow. Views onto the lagoon, and of course, a general image of the house. And here we can see how the wind can actually interact with the inside of the building. I'm going to go through quickly another house using a similar typology, except that in this one, we're using rammed earth to even improve insulation, from the outside, but also using the rammed earth as a aesthetic feature to complement the typology and the aesthetics of this house. Well, now that I've pretty much talked about what we do as experimentation in SCMFIA, I'm going to move on to actually what makes our practice specific to this geography. A few years ago, we decided to move from being architect to being developers because this is the only way we can actually act on the prerogative of government by ourselves. And we also felt it was important to take license in sort of doing urbanism and providing new typologies that we could actually rely on in order to sort of give a new face of architecture. So we started with this first project called Les Résidences Chocolat, which is 32 units on a relatively tight space, on 1.1 hectare. It's a compound where we aimed at the first thing we tried to do was to densify. Why did we have to densify? Because we live in a city with an exponential growth, moving from 1 million to 6. You can no longer, reach all the spaces that are sort of growing like mushrooming around the city. If you don't densify, then you'll find that it's quite expensive to bring water, to create roads, electricity, and all of that having to be supported by the state and financed by the state. So we felt it was actually time to sort of create a new model. As we went about creating the new model, also teaching people about what were the important subjects that we had to deal with in terms of architecture. Densification being, one of the major ones, and mobility, of course. And as you can see in this section, what we tried to do here is to get rid of the cars. We didn't want to have cars running around, so we created an underground space where we parked the car, and above that space, we have a communal space for the entire compound. And that actually has allowed the community to work differently. The big space in between has been like a major feature of this compound because it sort of recreated life in a very residential space, residential neighborhood where usually people tend to have one house on about 2,000 square meters. Here you can see in this image how dense the project is compared to the neighborhood. And after 4 years now, you can see that, we can see that in the neighborhood, people have also densified in terms of habitat. And of course, in order to do something like that, you have to pretty much have your hands free. And this is why we became developers, because we didn't want to have to deal with anybody. So we sort of controlled the entire chain from the design, of course, as architects. The design very important to us because we believe it is the way in which we can actually think differently about an entire ecosystem. So it's not just designing the architecture, but designing the entire ecosystem. Then we found ways to finance it. How do we find local financing in this environment, and where the banking system is not very alert? The third one is, how do we sell it? How do we sell something that is quite dense, something that is quite compact in a neighborhood where houses usually sit on 2,000 square meters? So one thing we did, for instance, is to sell it as a lifestyle, as opposed to square meters and space. And for financing, we knew we were pretty confident in the fact that our project would be successful. So we actually financed only half of it, and by the time we completed the entire project, we had sold all the units. So all of that to say that we need to be creative in the approach that we have with regards to architecture. When you're working in an environment like ours, where a lot of things are not structured. So as an architect, you need to go beyond your usual prerogatives and to have impacts on the city, to have a larger impact on the country, and create a new way of doing architecture. As you can see here, the house is relatively compact, and we're pretty much relying more on the environment than on the architecture to create interesting spaces. In this project, we have about 60% of green space that sort of brings not only a great deal of greenery, but air and tranquility. Even the underground spaces are cross-ventilated and naturally lit, so we can avoid any type of mechanical system and sort of rely on the natural elements to complement the architecture. An image of one of the living rooms, and here is one apartment furnished by one of the clients. More details about the bathrooms and materials. And now I'm moving to our next project. Having been comforted by the success of our first project, we felt it was probably time to move on to not only a different scale, but a different philosophy. The first one, the 32 units, was pretty much high-end, the one I just showed you, the Résidence Chocolat. And now we're moving on to another project that has 226 units. And of course, it is not as high-end as the first one. But the real interest about this project is that we can now deal with more functionalities, such as, for instance, creating office building, creating retail space, having a marina for the entire compound, and also relying on the local lagoon to sort of enhance and reinforce the mobility using boats. And that was pretty much the main reason why we chose that site. So these are mainly apartments. They're all cross-ventilated, as you can see here. That was one of the major points that we wanted to address, how to keep that idea of cross-ventilation in more formal and more urban projects. And we sort of kept all of the public spaces for the entire compound. So no unit directly on the water. And that allowed us to save this big promenade for the entire compound. What's interesting about the difference in scale is that we can introduce other features such as waste collection, waste management, office building, retail, and slowly moving to our idea of creating a sound, actually a sound unit, urban unit. And for us to have a sound urban unit, we should pretty much rely on what is happening in villages where you have a main character, that is the chief, that sort of rules everything around them. So governance is never delocalized, and governance is always central. And I think this is the main issue that we need to go after, to bring back governance into the hand of the people who live in the area. So especially when you have weak governance at the level of the state. So a lot of, I mean, a few other pictures of what we see in that compound with sports happening and again, ventilated and naturally lit parking space. Now I'm going to move on to another development project that we're embracing right now, which is probably going to be a project that we're going to be working on for the next 15 years. We have identified this village around Abidjan, which is sort of on a very nice spot, very well connected with water. But the roads are getting there and getting closer and closer. So what we foresee is that instead of development, chaos is going to reach the village and probably contaminated with this sort of unsound and chaotic development. So for us, it is important to start reflecting about what should happen to places like these, in this time of exponential growth and very fast development. And our idea was to restructure the place before the city actually reaches it. And how do we restructure the place? And first thing to do as architect, we sort of took the license to go and do some, a first scheme about the urban planning and decide sort of what we wanted to happen there in terms of future development. So we decided to rely on a few points that we think, are instrumental and are very, very important to what we're doing there. The first one is to create a sustainable development model, integrating, plural and transgenerational solutions, meaning that on this unit of habitat, we should find, different generations and have them work together. Another feature is that we wanted to have about 80% low-income housing. Why 80% low-income housing? Not because we want to have a low-income population, but because low-income housing can be a solution for young people who just starting in life, but also older people who are retiring. So for us, that was very important that we do aggregate the population not by social and economic status, but more by their ability to sort of take ownership of the place. So of course, things like youth connectivity, agriculture and employment, administrative and social leisure spaces are very important to that. And also, as we developed this, and as we're developing this place, we want to really push the idea of becoming totally autonomous with food, for instance, agriculture, use urban agriculture to do that, but also even go a step further and be autonomous in energy producing and also in what we see happening more and more, especially in the time of COVID here, the sort of reconciliation that we have with more traditional medicine and plants. So this is a project that we're still at the very beginning of, but that we rely a lot on for our, to sort of pretty much express where our vision is in terms of architecture and in terms of urban planning in this area. And now I'm going to move to some of the projects that we've developed recently solely as architects, not as developers, because we still have to take on projects as development is not enough to feed us, and too much research and not enough time not enough money to be able to develop them as full-time office. I'm going to start with The project for which we won the sports category at the WAF in 2018, which is a gymnasium that we did in the French school, French high school in Abidjan. It's a very simple project, relying on cross ventilation and on just layers stacked on top of the other. You know, the first layer is of course the base, the concrete. The second layer is a slab, and the third layer is the open space upstairs, and the fourth is the roof. You can see pretty much how the building develops here when they're all put together. But I think the most important feature about this building is the section. As you can see here in the section, you have the bottom part. Everything is cross-ventilated, so we make sure that we open on one side and on the other. The skin of the building is actually perforated metal sheeting to allow for air to go through. And as you can see in this section, the fact that we have this overhanging roof allows us to protect the building, you know, not only from rain, but also from the sun. So we have nice shaded spaces inside, but still can keep the cross ventilation happening through the building. Some images of the inside. The main sports room is very much connected to the outside through this perforated metal sheeting. You can see it, how it connects with the rest of the school, totally immersed in this garden. Some of the internal spaces. And as you can see here, we rely a lot on the natural elements. The lighting, natural lighting is very important, but also ventilation in a place where it can get pretty hot and pretty warm. Some images of the building and an image of the building in general. And now I'm going to move to this project, which is a spirituality center we had to develop at this basilica. We have this huge basilica, you know, that is a copy of St. Peter's Rome in Côte d'Ivoire. And this basilica, I mean, people decided that they wanted to have a spirituality center not too far on the same site. And of course, it was a major political decision to decide to sort of break away from the architecture that is sitting there right now, as you can see, which has nothing tropical, and go to something more in line with what we have in terms of environment. Here you can see, you know, what is surrounding the basilica. You see the basilica from afar, and you see the gardens, which are pretty green and lush. So it was important for us to sort of get back into features of architecture that would reconnect us to the natural elements. As you can see here, we're using a lot of similar roofs, you know, sloping roofs to collect the water easily, but also, you know, to have very simple way of building that can just do what it's supposed to do, which is bring light and airflow, so that we have quite nice temperatures inside. The body of water, of course, allows for the cooling, and the rest of the buildings are mainly made of you know, very basic structure and a rammed earth, as you can see here. Here's a chapel, inside of the chapel. And now I'm just going to finish quickly with this last project, which for us is major, actually, because it's addressing issues that we were never able to address as architects in terms of scale. We've been reached by the government of Benin to design 20,000 units as habitat, because there's a lack of habitat, and they need to provide at least that much units in their capital city. And of course, when you're facing something like that, people in government don't necessarily tell you they don't necessarily give you a program about what you need to design along with the 20,000 units. So our main task here, actually beyond the architecture, was the urbanism and designing major roads. How do we collect water on those roads? How do we provide for an urban setting that is very close to what we're used to, having having like vendors on the street, relying on typography to collect the water, and and also develop different ways of moving along. And major feature on this project is to keep it green and keep it cross-ventilated. And what we've achieved finally is a model that can be sort of owned by pretty much anyone as long as they can pay their monthly fee. So no necessity to have traceability of revenue, and don't have necessarily to be tied up to a bank. And so these are actually ways in which we can sort of make the model more flexible and reach more and more people in our cities to engage with architecture. And I would like to end up with that. And hopefully, this has been a little overview and a little peek into what we do here, and probably what more and more African architects should do. Thank you very much.
So perhaps I could ask you a direct question about the relationship between your work and the vernacular architecture of Côte d'Ivoire, as I was just trying to discuss.
Well, actually, it's very linked. And the interesting thing is that when we started looking at those systems, we realized that we did not necessarily have to rely so much on local materials, but more on the systems. For instance, when you take the south of Ivory Coast, the humidity is just calling for cross ventilation. So if you use Ramdurf there, it's not going to do anything. So what we rely on is how do we create cross ventilation is just opening on both sides that are opposed. So I mean, you can use any sort of a window to do that. So it's not necessarily relying on the materials. And actually, when you move away from the south of Ivory Coast and you go up north, you're confronted to a different reality. Less water, less humidity, drier. So you'd rather rely on rammed earth type of earth systems that sort of can guarantee insulation inside and sort of resist more the fluctuating temperatures. So I think it's really about the systems, more than the materials.
Yes, I mean, I understand that. And of course, what you're doing is creating an architecture that is unmistakably contemporary. And you're dealing with a very contemporary condition of a city like Abidjan, which has grown, what was it, from 1 million people in 1970 to 6.5 million people now, which of course is a
Yes.
very contemporary condition.
Yes, indeed.
And I think another point which I'd like to ask you about is the relationship between architecture and governance. Now, you alluded to having a weak central state. So in a sense, do you have to devise an architecture that can be a substitute for governance, or how does it work? How do you overcome the issue of a weak state and actually provide a system, a social and an economic system that works through architecture?
Well, that was a question that was central to our action, actually. My partner was for a long time president of the Order of Architects. So through that channel, we're able to meet people in government and talk to ministers about what we thought and the vision of architecture should be in a country like Côte d'Ivoire. But we were very much confronted to the following attitude. When you're in the minister's office and you're talking about those subjects, they seem to be quite interested in what you're doing. But the minute you leave, I mean, they have other things to do. And we were, wondering why should one minister rely on our vision to develop their program? So if we feel that our vision is worth something, we need to try and go and test it. And if we do test it and if it works, then it will have the effects that we want it to have. So this goes to say that there's very little functioning link between, a body of architects, like the Order of Architects in Abidjan. When you sort of confront them to government, and government tend to believe that they have other things to do, things that are more urgent. And most of the time in African geographies, we tend to prioritize other issues such as medicine, schooling, and what have you, rather than architecture. And we've been for a long time telling them that architectural is integral to all those issues. So unless we as architects decide to go out and test things and sort of come back with a conclusion, it's going to be very, very hard for governments to just take on those issues and work on them.
And of course, the fact that you're doing experimental work in Asine Mafia is the sort of underpinning to all of that. You're showing that architecture, the sort of architecture you want to make, works and can work in that context. And that perhaps gives you both the experience and the authority to work on these larger scale projects as developers and as initiators yourself.
Absolutely, yeah.
Good. And I think we're coming to the end of the session, but thank you very much. Okay, in that case, I'm going to ask another question because I think we have a little bit more time than I had anticipated. And I thought maybe we can talk a bit more about where, if the materials you're using are not, as it were, those of the local vernacular, where do they come from? Are they locally made? Are they locally available? Or what is the sort of material palette that you have available?
We try to work as much as possible with materials that are available locally. In the process of trying to shy away from the traditional materials and get closer to Ramdurf and other type of materials of that nature. But the paradox is that they cost more than the traditional brick and mortar. This is, of course, the work of lobbies and the work of the local economic situation. And actually, it's not specific to Côte d'Ivoire. Actually, if you go to many, or actually most African capitals, you will see that the preferred way of building is cement and corrugated sheeting. And that even goes beyond the technical aspects of it and sort of permeates the social aspects of it. If you go to a village and you start building with brick and mortar, people will find your building more desirable, even if it accumulates more heat. So there's also a lot of pedagogy to be done on this in this direction, so that people can better understand what their traditional architecture is doing.
Sure, and there's a strong tradition across much of sub-Saharan Africa, as I understand it, of ordinary people, I mean, even in shanty towns where they have to build for themselves, using these materials in incredibly inventive ways that make very seductive imagery.
Yes, absolutely. And it's actually interesting. I was doing some work with younger architects in the place as sort of a shanty town of Abidjan, and we went there, thinking that we could come up with solutions. And the first thing they told us is, well, you guys cannot work for us. You don't know our psychology, you don't know our sociology, you don't know our economic system, you don't know what type of materials is available to us. Your role should be to be a link between government and us to provide water, electricity, but don't think about doing architecture for us. Which was a huge lesson, for us as architects, and actually made sense because the minute you walk inside those developments, you see that they're all organized because the state is not organizing it, so the people are doing it themselves. So they have chiefs, women's associations, young people associations. They do compost, they do urban agriculture. So they're pretty much set on many issues, probably more than the more formal city is.
And in the couple of minutes or so we have left, can you say a little bit more about how you're including low-cost housing, and just how low cost is that? Is that for the very poor, or is it just for people on relatively slightly lower incomes? Because I guess there is considerable poverty in Abidjan.
Yes, actually, and the challenge actually is and I was thinking about this issue recently and looking at what we call poverty, really. Having traveled a lot and extensively in the country, the minute you leave the big cities, you don't tend to see poverty. You see people who are living sort of in accordance with their means and are not desiring to acquire other things. This is what happens when you get to the edge of the cities, where, you know, if you live a village and you come to a city, when you're living in an environment where food is free, lodging is free, mobility is zero, to a place where you have to pay for food, pay for houses, pay for medication. So to me, this is what creates this disruption. And this is actually what creates the type of shanty town we see at the edges of our cities. And when you also look at those spaces and you look at the materials they use to build, they're not necessarily cheap. Which actually makes me think that the poverty is more kind of intellectual poverty, where um, they're maybe lacking the means to create a sound space for themselves because they come from a very organized environment to a place where there's very little governance. So actually, the more I think about it, poverty is not about the lack of mean, but lack of material mean, but more lack of intellectual means. And the type of housing that we do, for instance, in Benin, we don't necessarily go directly to that, you know, very low end of the society, but try to actually provide for the more, you know, the most, the bigger size of the population that needs housing. And as you're thinking about that, you know, one thing that is very key is how do we industrialize the process of creating housing? And because this is the only way you can respond to the, you know, to 100,000 needs for a new housing, you know, on a daily basis. And of course, we're still quite experimental on those issues because our governments are still relying on very traditional ways of doing housing, you know, which is like those small houses I showed in the beginning.
Well, thank you.
The
Yeah. Sorry, thanks very much, because I think that's a great note to end on, is having to be experimental in thinking about housing and how that can work with systems of governance and existing social systems. So, Issa, thank you very much for a fascinating description of what you do and the challenges of architecture in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much.